Coming to the third speaker of tonight, joining us from the Silicon Valley, Alex Stamos. Alex Stamos is working at the forefront of improving cybersecurity through his research and teaching at the Stanford Center for International Security and Collaboration, and is director of the Stanford Center at the Stanford Internet Observatory. Before joining academia, Alex Stamos served as Chief Security Officer of Facebook, where he was responsible for understanding and mitigating the information security risks to the company and its 2.5 billion users. He has also led the investigations into the manipulation of the 2016 election in the US. And he also has helped pioneer several successful protections against these new forms of abuse. What have we learned from cyber attacks? And where does the world go from here? This will be discussed by our third speaker tonight. A warm welcome to Alex Stamos.
Thank you very much. Thanks, everybody. I guess we're doing this way. So sorry, just a second. So my name's Alex. As you heard, I am the director of the Stanford Internet Observatory. And I work on these areas of cyber risk and trust and safety, as well as do private work with a number of companies that are facing these kinds of issues. What I thought I'd do today is talk a little bit about how cyber risk is now playing into the kind of overall risk of corporations, and how corporations have now been brought in as being on the front lines of defending their societies from cyber attack. We have this incredible and historical blurring of lines between state and corporate responsibility, and it's caused some real interesting problems over the last couple of years, and there's no sign of that changing anytime in the future. So if I was actually able to see all of you, if we were in a classroom together, I would do a Socratic method, and I would call on somebody to tell me where this is at the moment. This was a picture taken in Tahrir Square of Egypt in January 2011. The start of was generally known as the Arab Spring. The Arab Spring was a series of uprisings across the Middle East and North Africa against autocratic governments that was widely described as being driven by social media and the internet. That the fact that these activists and journalists and students mostly had access to communication technologies that allowed them to organize and to communicate with one another without censorship for the first time in history allowed them to create these large-scale protest movements that they hoped would bring a new era of democracy and prosperity to these countries. This is what Tahrir Square looked like 2 years later. And the unfortunate truth, while this was kind of a high watermark of the belief in the liberating power of technologies, it turns out that with one major exception, and that exception would be Tunisia, most of these countries ended up with worse governments than they had even before. There was an overthrow of the Egyptian government at the time, and a series of new leaders and smaller revolutions, which ended then with a government that was as oppressive as the original Egyptian government, but just much smarter about the use of technology to suppress domestic dissent. And this is kind of the outcome of the Arab Spring, was that you now have the use of the internet to control and suppress native populations, of domestic populations, to be on the forefront of the ability of autocrats to maintain their power. That is just another tool in their quiver. The other thing that we've seen over the last several years has been the rise of cyber power as being on the forefront of great power competition. This is from a military parade in China. These are members of the People's Liberation Army Navy, the Navy of the People's Republic of China. Not these exact guys, some people who work for the People's Liberation Army, who are probably not as tall and good looking as the folks that bring on parade, are are at the forefront of hacking on behalf of the People's Republic of China and therefore the Chinese Communist Party. It is estimated that the People's Liberation Army has over 140,000 employees working on cyber. So that is larger than the entire militaries of most countries on this planet, just working on Chinese cyber operations. And these operations run the gamut from very, very careful operations to gather up intelligence to direct attacks against Western corporations for whom there are domestic competitors in China, all the way to destructive attacks as part of activism on behalf of the Chinese Communist Party, especially when you talk about places like Hong Kong and Taiwan with conflicts of sovereignty. The other issue we've seen over the last couple of years is that, starting with China, but not restricted to China, we've seen a number of developing economies explicitly turn to cyber as an economic growth strategy. This was, kind of an explicit and pretty open part of Chinese economic growth starting in the early 2000s, but that model has now spread to a number of other countries. And somewhat ironically, China is now a major target of it. So some of the countries for which hacking is allowed for economic purposes by a combination of state actors and private organizations, started with China. You now have South Korea, Vietnam, India, Pakistan, a number of other nations where they allow this capability to be built in the private sector and to be utilized on behalf of their national champions. And in many of those cases, China is now the target. When you look at like Vietnamese actors that are operating on behalf of Vietnamese economic interests, a lot of their target is China because those are the companies that they are trying to compete against on the global marketplace. And so we have this really interesting kind of model where you have the state actors working on behalf of express state interests, such as intelligence gathering, working side by side and perhaps even being some of the same people who are then allowed to operate on behalf of economic interests. When you have that latter operations, the amount of command and control that you have from the government overall is often mysterious or nebulous, and there's a certain amount of plausible deniability by the state, by the government, of whether or not these actors have been approved or not. This kind of fuzzy relationship between the direct command and control authority and individual cyber actors has led to some very interesting situations over the last couple of years. One important use of state power for which corporations were on the front line was the release of a piece of malware called NotPetya several years ago. NotPetya was a piece of malware that looked like ransomware. It looked like it was supposed purported to be released for economic purposes, but it turns out there was no way that you could actually appropriately pay the authors of NotPetya and get your devices unlocked. It was actually a worm that was meant to cause damage, and that worm was released specifically to damage companies that operate within Ukraine. This was toward the backdrop of the overall Russian-Ukrainian conflict, including the invasion of Crimea. NotPetya was built into as a piece of malware into the software that is officially distributed by the Ukrainian government as a software necessary to file Ukrainian taxes. So any company that operates in Ukraine has to pay Ukrainian taxes. They have to download this piece of software to file it. The Russian government broke into the vendors for that software, embedded this piece of malware, and then at a pre-specified time on all of these tax-paying computers across the world, that malware woke up and then scanned the internal network to move from machine to machine. One of the big victims of this was the Maersk shipping line, headquartered in Denmark and London, where computers all across the world were taken offline by NotPetya, including computers on the ships themselves. Now, there's no examples of the control systems on ships of like what actually steers the rudder, controls the engines and such being taken down, but the computers that are like on the captain's desktop, for example, that tell him these are your tasking orders, this is what you're going to offload and such, went down. And so you ended up with the loss of communication across the entire Maersk shipping line, as well as to all of the operations in the ports where containers were loaded and unloaded. This caused huge economic destruction across the country, across the world, and a huge amount of cost to Maersk. Funny enough, the only reason they were able to recover reasonably quickly was because there was a power outage in one of their ports in Africa, and therefore the machines there were not able to be infected. And so you had a situation where IT people were pulling hard drives out of these offline computers in Africa and then flying to hand them off to a team that was operating out of London to bring the Maersk network back up. But a great example of an attack with a geopolitical purpose, in this case to punish companies operating in Ukraine, having really widespread impact. We saw a similar issue here in the United States just in the last several weeks. These are real photos of the gas lines that existed during a hack of what's called the Colonial Pipeline. So this is a pipeline that would bring refined gasoline and other fuels up from the factories on the Gulf Coast in Texas, all the way up to New England along the eastern seaboard of the United States. Colonial Pipeline was infected by ransomware. Ransomware is software that is released for an economic purpose. It locks up people's computers, it steals data, and then it allows the makers of that ransomware to demand tribute be paid, that a ransom be paid. Otherwise, those computers will not be returned to service, and often they will take the data they have stolen and they will release it out in the public. The ransomware actors behind this were part of a group of affiliates that operate out of Russia. And the impact of this has raised a lot of interesting questions about state responsibility. So I showed you the folks marching in the parade, and we talked about, the People's Liberation Army has real employees, full uniformed members of the military with uniforms who are paid state salaries, who work in state facilities, who are hacking on behalf of the People's Republic. They are clearly the responsibility of the government of the People's Republic of China, whereas these actors are operating from Russia with the tacit approval of the Russian forces, Russian government and law enforcement. But the real interesting question is whether or not these specific targets are ever approved, or whether they're operating within a framework of what kind of disruption they're allowed to cause. Now, in this case, this group was immediately disrupted, it looks like, by counterattacks by US Cyber Command. And it has raised very interesting questions of whether or not there will be collective punishment of Russia by the United States and our allies because these ransomware operators are allowed to operate with impunity. This is actually a pretty big, this is a pretty explicit demonstration of the danger of ransomware, but this kind of stuff happens every single day. All across the world, you have small to medium companies that fall because of ransomware, that lose millions and millions of dollars and sometimes go out of business. And the fact that this has been allowed to that these people have been allowed to operate out of Russia for years on end is causing a huge amount of friction between the US and Russia. And then at the same time that we have these kinds of cyber attacks, we also have information warfare. So we don't really have time to get deeply into this, but as everybody here knows, a number of countries operate very aggressive propaganda outlet mechanisms that will operate both in the media space and the declared space, as well as very quietly online. And from the large countries like the Chinas and Russias, you have these full spectrum operations where you have intelligence operations that are run by professionals, that are powered by humans intelligence and signals intelligence that have traditionally been collected by the government, but then have both operational offensive cyber components as well as information warfare components that might be individual units. So these people, just like when we talk about hackers, they might be working directly for governments, or they might be private organizations that sell their services to the highest bidder. And we've seen this massive growth of propaganda as a service, of the creation of private companies that spend all of their time spreading disinformation on behalf of their clients, which can either be governments or can be private companies themselves. And this is kind of the real dangerous future we're facing, where the combination of offensive cyber capability, which allows you to gather up information that other people don't have, to read emails, to read documents, to get access to primary sources, combined with disinformation capabilities to spread and to manipulate the conversation around the world, can be incredibly, incredibly dangerous. The best example of this would be the 2016 hack against the Democratic National Committee and the release of emails which completely overturned how people were discussing the election and discussing the candidates in 2016 here in the United States. Probably the best example of a hybrid action. But since that happened, we have seen this kind of behavior all across the world, where a stolen document, stolen email, and perhaps then some manipulated documents and email and now videos are all mixed up together and then spread through an information operation to affect democracy. What all of this brings up is the relationship now between governments and corporations. And we need to come up with a new model by which there is cooperation both between the public and private sectors within democracies, and then between democracies themselves. this whole relationship was really overturned in 2013 with the release of the documents that were taken by Edward Snowden and then released to the media, which drove a wedge between the US government and the private companies in the United States and between the United States and its allies overseas. Even now, there are still lawsuits happening in Europe based upon the Snowden disclosures to say that American companies can't operate in Europe and the like. Unfortunately, while we kind of fight amongst ourselves among this relationship, you have these groups that are operating out of Russia, China, Belarus, a number of former Soviet states, as well as, again, emerging economies like Vietnam that are now running rampant and that are attacking private sector entities that do not have the ability to protect themselves. And so one of the real critical things that we're going to need to see out of the Western alliance, the United States and the rest of the NATO countries, including Germany, is we're going to need to see a democratic and privacy-preserving model for which the public sector can help the private sector do defense. Because the truth is that this current model where you have the public sector entities, intelligence agencies only getting involved in the most extreme cases like the Colonial Pipeline hack is not working out. That we need some kind of better integration of both watching these kinds of things and preventative work, and that we obviously want to do so in a way that that protects the privacy of individuals, with the understanding that it does not help anybody's privacy if all of our information is sitting in data warehouses operated by the Ministry of State Security or the Russian SVR, which is the kind of the situation that we have collectively chosen to be in the last 7 years. Anyway, thank you very much for your time. It's a pleasure to talk with you, and I'm looking forward to your questions.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Alex Stamos, for your talk. And I'd say we jump right into the questions. We already got some from our audience. And the first one that, some people are interested in is, how would you evaluate the dangerous reward ratio of digitalization governmental actions? So elections, bureaucracy, healthcare, with regards to cyber security?
That's an excellent question. And I think one of the real challenges we face is that a number of countries have really dove in heads first into digitization of government services because it is incredibly efficient. It allows you to provide better services to your citizens. It allows you to be more responsive, allows you to do more with fewer people. And there's a lot of benefits to that, but the cyber risk involved in that is very rarely considered. And so I think from my perspective, digitization is good, but what we need to do is we need to specifically think about the worst case scenarios, and in those cases have procedural and effectively analog backups that prevent the worst case scenario. The best example of this would be around voting. So, there are lots of benefits of the internet and modern computer technologies in making voting more efficient. But here in the United States, our last election, things as bad as things are in the US right now, which is pretty bad in that we have an entire political party that is working to undermine the very basic notions of how our democracy operates. Things would be way worse if the major competitive states in the last election did not have paper backups. And that is the key thing that is helping us right now, is that in Arizona, Pennsylvania, Georgia, that even if you use an electronic mechanism to vote, which provides a lot of benefits for people who are blind, for people who don't speak English and want to get their ballot in a different language, people who need a variety of different accessibility benefits, electronic voting could be really good for them, but the output of that electronic voting machine was a paper ballot that is very difficult to fake and that can be recounted and audited appropriately. The fact that the model has that paper ballot backup has been really critical. And so as we digitize different parts of government services, we need to make sure there is a human in the loop, or is there some kind of piece of paper or other analog break for the really critical steps that, if they were hacked, would cause huge disruption.
Thanks for that answer. The next question is, how is the origin of these attacks identified?
That's a great question. And so this is called the attribution problem. And this is a very key and open issue with our field overall, which is attribution is often provided by a combination of private actors as well as government agencies. And in some cases, those groups who provide attribution will show their work. They will say, we are attributing to this government because of these IP addresses and this virtual machine and this piece of code and this evidence. In some cases, they just say, you have to trust us, because they don't want to demonstrate what kind of information they have. And this has been a real interesting challenge, because there's a lot of folks who don't trust the attribution, especially when it comes from government agencies. The work around here has often been that allies will show the attribution details to other allies of theirs, and then have the governments speak on their behalf. And I think we're going to see more of this, where if you see a private organization like a Mandiant FireEye come out and say, we attribute this attack to the SVR, but we're not going to show all the details, the SVR being the Foreign Intelligence Service of the Russian Federation. But we're not going to show all the details, then the US government can say, yes, we at Cyber Command agree, and we have shown our details to our friends in the United Kingdom, the Netherlands, and Germany, and then you hear from the government agencies in those countries saying, yes, we have seen the details and we agree as well. But there is a challenge, and some groups are very careful about covering up their tracks. Some are much less careful. In some cases, it's easy to figure it out, and sometimes it's quite hard, and you never actually know who's responsible for it. But even in the cases where they haven't covered up their tracks, demonstrating to the wider world of why your attribution is accurate turns out to be a big problem.
Thanks a lot for this answer, and we're already coming to the last question of tonight for you. That is, in your opinion, what's the % distribution between state-sponsored hacking for political reasons and non-state actors for economical reasons?
That's a great question. And anything that is money-based will always outstrip everything else, right? So I would expect that of the really damaging hacks that are happening, something at 75 to 80% of them are economically driven. Just because this is the nature of capitalism. If you create an economic model with very low barriers to entry, and the barriers to entry into doing ransomware are extremely low, then you'll have a huge number of actors move into that field. Now, a couple of large groups are the ones who are most successful. There's a group called Revil, which has been extremely successful. Again, a coalition of different hacking groups that operates out of Russia. So you do see this interesting model where you have these kind of, just like you have in other kind of capitalistic situations, you have these conglomerates that rise to the top, and they will take a large chunk, but then you still have kind of guerrilla capitalism at the bottom of lots of smaller groups working. So yeah, again, I would say probably 75, 80% of the really damaging hacks that are happening are based upon economic models. Most of that is ransomware.
All right. Thanks so much for those numbers and for answering all of our questions. It was really an honor having you with us tonight. I hope you enjoyed it quite a bit.